part of the European Council's EU-Turkey statement of the 18th of March. The common handling of the refugee crisis that was agreed at that occasion has clearly yielded results. The intention was to put an end to the shameless exploitation of human suffering by ruthless criminals. We can now say that their business model is breaking down. Fewer people are risking their lives by crossing the Aegean Sea. There are now, on average, less than 100 arrivals a day in the Greek islands, down from thousands that we saw arriving in the autumn and even early this year. The Turkey facility is off to a promising start and helps provide better conditions for refugees. By the end of July, we expect to allocate €1 billion in EU funding for their healthcare, education and food. We need to continue working closely with Turkey to protect these vulnerable people. As you know, the EU's cooperation with Turkey, as decided by the European Council, is based on mutual commitments. One of the commitments the European Council made was to speed up work on the previously agreed roadmap to achieve visa-free travel for Turkish citizens. Turkey indicated it would be able to accelerate all the reforms necessary to reach fulfilment of the benchmarks sooner than previously agreed. This process is based on a set of 72 clearly defined benchmarks which make sure that all the safeguards that should accompany visa-free travel are in place. These include strong guarantees on security and measures that prevent travellers from overstaying. Over the last weeks, Turkey has made impressive progress. There is still work to be done as a matter of urgency. But if Turkey sustains the progress made and continues at the same pace, they can meet the remaining benchmarks. This is why we are now in a position to put forward a proposal which opens the way for the European Parliament and Member States to decide to lift visa requirements once the benchmarks have been met. There is no free ride here, and we are clear about what remains to be done. There are 5 remaining benchmarks that we expect Turkey to meet by the end of June. These 5 benchmarks consist of measures to prevent corruption, negotiating an operational agreement with Europol, offering judicial cooperation to all EU member states, bringing data protection rules in line with EU standards, and revising the legislation on terrorism. Another benchmark will be met on the 1st of June when the EU-Turkey readmission agreement enters into force. Turkey will be given until the end of the year to upgrade its passports so that they meet the latest biometric standards. But let me be very clear. In the meantime, no Turkish citizen will enter the EU without a visa if they don't have a biometric passport with a facial image and fingerprint data. And I want to stress that I would rather have somebody at my border with a biometric passport where I can be sure that the person carrying the passport is actually the person mentioned in the passport, because I can check with facial recognition and fingerprints, rather than a person with an old-fashioned passport and a paper visa where the guarantee that the person carrying the passport is the person mentioned in the passport is less strong than with a biometric passport. So I think this is quite an achievement if we reach that level with biometric passports with Turkey. And let me be very clear. The remaining benchmarks are challenging and important and will require political determination for Turkey to fulfil the commitments it undertook on the 18th of March. We will send our proposals to the European Parliament and the Council. It should make it possible to take a decision by the end of June based on what Turkey will then have delivered. On the basis of a number of discussions with Member States in recent weeks, we have also decided to propose strengthening the suspension mechanism for all countries that are granted visa-free travel. The mechanism will then become easier to use by extending the possible grounds for suspension and by drastically speeding the process up. The Commission would also be able to trigger the mechanism on its own initiative. Our cooperation with third countries is just one part of our work to achieve better and more sustainable management of migration. And by the way, we will present further ideas in June on how to work with third countries to tackle our common challenges. I would now like to turn to the reform of our common European asylum system. We need to make sure that people who need protection receive it. This is our moral duty and legal responsibility. But we need to rethink how this responsibility can be fairly shared. We've seen in the past year how a few member states were placed under incredible strain. This is a direct consequence of the shortcomings of the Dublin system in its current form. It was simply not designed to deal with situations such as these, where a large number of refugees arrive in a single country in a short period of time. 1 month ago, we presented also here options for reform, and we have now listened to the reactions of the European Parliament and the Member States in the Council. The simple truth is that if Member States do not find a common approach to sharing the responsibility for the handling of the refugee crisis, at the end of the day, not a single Member State will be able to handle that responsibility on its own. We either face this challenge together, or we give up on facing it at all, with dire consequences for all, because if there's no solidarity here, in a short period of time, there will be no solidarity elsewhere, in other areas. And that will be a huge blow to the European project. And those countries who sometimes now refuse to show solidarity in this area should understand that what they're playing with is a more comprehensive approach to the way we share challenges, we share responsibilities, and we share each other's difficulties, which is, I think, since the beginning of European integration and cooperation, at the core of what it is to be European. You don't turn your back on the problems of your neighbours. You share a common responsibility for a common solution. And that is why I believe it is essential to present a proposal today that will make it possible for all Member States to take their responsibility. That is why we need to introduce a corrective mechanism in our Dublin system. It will be triggered automatically, so that whenever a Member State has to face a disproportionate number of asylum applications, responsibility for new applicants of all nationalities will be transferred to other Member States. Once the pressure is relieved, that Member State will again take responsibility for new applicants. Each Member State's share will be based on clear and simple criteria: population size and GDP. Their resettlement efforts will also be taken into account, in line with our objective to provide safe and legal pathways to Europe. All Member States will be required to contribute and show solidarity. This may also take the form of financial solidarity. If, temporarily, a Member State does not relocate asylum applicants, they will need to support those who do. We all know, just go and ask local and regional authorities in countries such as Germany, Austria, Finland, Sweden. The cost on local and regional authorities is huge. And if a form of solidarity could be that those countries that do not take the refugee but see their part being taken by another, if those countries could show the solidarity by supporting the Member State where people go financially, so that costs can be borne easier, I think that would be a show of solidarity. The new system will also be more efficient, with shorter processes for assigning responsibility and processing applications. It will discourage abuses with clear obligations for applicants and safeguards against asylum shopping. The right to international protection does not come with the right to choose the country where you want to have that international protection. At the same time, we will better protect the rights of those who seek refuge through better safeguards for unaccompanied minors and stronger guarantees that families will be kept together. This is the general picture, and I now would like to give the floor to Dimitris to go into the details of a number of these things and also to refer to the other decisions the College took today.
Thank you, Franz. Dear all, good afternoon. Let me just say that today is really an important day because we finally present our legislative proposal to ambitiously reform of Dublin. This is something that I have been calling for already during my hearing before being appointed European Commissioner 1.5 years ago. Today, we finally take a step forward towards a fair and more equitable asylum system for all member states by building the concept of solidarity and responsibility, sharing into the foundations of the system. I grab this opportunity to remind you all that when we talk about solidarity and responsibility, we not refer to moral principles, but also to legal ones, since they are explicitly stipulated in the text of the treaties. So it is the moment for all of us, member states, the Commission, of course, to prove what do we really mean when we talk about these two principles. And this is not only valid for Dublin, which is only one element of our wider reform of the common European asylum system. Today, we also propose to reform Eurodac and to turn the European Asylum Support Office into a genuine EU agency for asylum. With the new Eurodac system, member states will be able to store and search fingerprints for all third country nationals who apply for asylum, who are stateless or are found to be staying irregularly within the European Union. That's why Eurodac can be directly used for facilitating readmission and return operations. Pulling data, not just on fingerprints, but also names, dates of birth, nationalities, and travel documents will allow immigration officials to request information with just one click. Our asylum system can only work with a stronger agency. Just like we turned Frontex into a European Borders and Coast Guard, we propose to turn the European Asylum Support Office into a fully fledged European Union agency for asylum, with a stronger mandate and more operational tasks in order to offer more support. The new agency will operationalise the fairness mechanism of the new Dublin system. Everything will be centralised, transparent and objective. We will also equip the new agency financially and operationally with more resources. We want the new agency to dispose of a reserve pool of minimum 500 experts from member states, so it can deploy asylum support teams rapidly when a member state is suddenly facing disproportionate migratory pressures. Speaking of migratory pressure, that brings me to the other point we discussed today in the College: Schengen and temporary internal border controls. As you know, and as I have also said many times, our objective is to return to a normalisation of Schengen with no internal borders control as soon as possible. But in order to take that step forward in safeguarding Schengen, we need to take some intermediate steps. As we still face deficiencies at our external borders, we need to take temporary steps to allow for the exceptional continuation of existing controls at certain internal borders of the European Union. Let me first acknowledge that Greece has made significant progress in the last few months and weeks. However, not all of the serious deficiencies identified could be adequately and comprehensively addressed within the 3 months limit that was set in line with the Schengen Borders Code. With a large number of asylum seekers still in Greece, but some also along the Western Balkans route, we still face a risk of secondary movements. As a result, we propose that the Council recommends that Austria, Germany, Sweden, Denmark and Norway maintain the internal border controls at specific border crossing points for up to 6 months. We do not propose the introduction of border controls at the Schengen borders of Greece, namely at airports and ports. Let me reiterate that our proposal should be seen as an exceptional temporary measure to ultimately allow for the safeguarding and return to a normal functioning Schengen area as soon as possible. Finally, in the College today we adopted 2 proposals for visa liberalisation. For Turkey, our report and proposal are very clear. The Turkish authorities have made remarkable progress since the 18th of March, the EU-Turkey summit took place, but there is still a lot of work to be done. Our proposal is based on the understanding that all benchmarks have to be met as a matter of urgency. The fulfilment and implementation of these benchmarks will bring closer our legal and political systems and help enhance our cooperation in the field of operations. But today, I am also very pleased to propose visa liberalisation for Kosovo. We propose visa liberalisation on the understanding that the ratification of the border agreement with Montenegro and the further strengthening of the track record in the fight against organised crime and corruption will be confirmed before adoption of the proposal by the European Parliament and the Council. Today's report and proposal are the results of the hard work and successful efforts of the Kosovo authorities in achieving far-reaching and difficult reforms in the justice and home affairs area and beyond. Of course, we will continue to monitor this further progress very closely. I know how important visa-free travel is for the citizens of Kosovo, and I'm very glad to be able to present this proposal today. I hope that the European Parliament and the Council will adopt our proposal very soon. Let me be clear. Visa liberalisation does not mean uncontrolled entry into the European Union. Only people who have biometric passports can enter. Moreover, these visa liberalisation efforts should also be seen as part of our wider approach to migration, security and borders. Recently, we tabled a very important proposal for an entry-exit system which will allow for a solid tracking of all third country nationals crossing our external borders and, in particular, overstayers. The European Parliament and Council should speed up work to get adopted. In autumn, I will present a proposal for an EU travel information and authorisation system, the equivalent of the ESTA system in the United States. So visa-exempt travellers will register relevant information regarding their intended stay in the European Union. In this context, equally important is our amendment to the visa suspension mechanism, as France explained already. Today is an important day, internally when it comes to reforming our asylum systems and managing our internal borders, and externally when it comes to our proposals for visa liberalisation.
You've been listening to the European Migration Commissioner Dimitris Avramopoulos, who's been speaking alongside Frans Timmermans, who is the first European Commissioner, Vice President. Both men stressed that a visa-free entry into Europe did not mean that this would be uncontrolled. They stressed that they were impressed with Turkey's progress, but there was no free ride here. They said Turkey knows what needs to be done. It is very clear, and they went on to stress a number of different points that were necessary. Well, let's cross now to Simon McGregor-Wood, who joins us from Brussels. Simon, Frans Timmermans there saying that there were 5 points that Turkey needed to kind of firm up before this would be given the go-ahead.
Yeah, it's not a bad achievement, is it? If we're looking at this as a report card, clearly they've complied 67 out of 72 of the benchmarks Turkey has managed to deal with. And if you consider that European diplomats were telling people that only 2-3 weeks ago they had only done half of that number, you can see how hard the Turkish government has been working. We spoke earlier to the Turkish permanent ambassador to the European Union here in Brussels. He said that in the last week alone, his information was that the Turkish government has managed to push through 20 benchmark compliances, which is an extraordinary effort. But clearly there is no end. This is not the end of the deal. As you correctly say, 5 remaining ones, and they are quite big ones. They're quite sensitive ones. They're political. They're not so much technical. They're things to do with legislation to ensure corruption, particularly on things like political party financing in Turkey, big issues like data protection, and also things like the legislation, counter-terrorism legislation, about which there are concerns here in the European Union, the extent to which some of that legislation in Turkey may be used politically. Those are big issues, and clearly this deal won't go forward unless the Turks manage to tick those boxes off by the end of June. But clearly, as you say, a very significant and impressive progress, to use the words of Frans Timmermans. The question now is whether the Turkish government can deliver on those 5 remaining issues before this process is then presented to the European Parliament here in Brussels, which has the power of final ratification, if you like. But certainly, good news for Turkey so far.
Simon, they also went on to mention how important biometric standards were, that no Turkish citizen would be able to enter the EU without facial imagery and fingerprinting on their passports. Remind us when that needs to be implemented, and also the issue of the asylum system, this new asylum system that is likely to be set up.
Yep. Well, the introduction of biometric passports has always been one of the central benchmarks of this visa liberalisation process. It applies not only to Turkey, it's part of the rule book for all of the countries waiting for liberalisation. And I am not clear personally the extent to which Turkish citizens have or do not have biometric passports, but it was interesting, wasn't it, that Frans Timmermans was absolutely categoric that regardless of when this deal is introduced, Turkish citizens will still have to enter the Schengen zone of the European Union with a biometric passport. They won't accept old-fashioned ones. This is for reasons of security and cross-checking. So if you're going to make advantage of this as a Turkish citizen from the beginning of July, if all goes well, you'll still need to do so with a biometric passport. So Turkish citizens, by the end of the year, surely, will have to have a biometric passport to get visa-free travel in the European Union. And then, of course, you're right, Frans Timmermans moved on to this broader issue of how the European Union is going to reform the so-called Dublin regulations. This is the regulation system by which the European Union applies its asylum-seeking rules and laws, if you like. It's clear that in the recent years, given the huge influx of migration, that this system needed a complete root and branch overhauling. We've seen that the Greeks and the Italians have taken a huge burden of the numbers arriving on Europe's shores, and the Europeans are desperate to try and find a system to make it fairer. Solidarity is the word that is repeated and came up several times during that press conference. Controversially, yes, they confirmed this thing that had been leaked, that if a country, let's say Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, countries that have traditionally been reluctant to share the burden of refugees, continue to refuse to do so if there is another crisis, they will be asked to pay significant sums of money into a central pot, which will then be given to the Greeks and the Italians to help deal with the enormous numbers of refugees and asylum seekers in those countries. So a confirmation of that notion that the solidarity, the sharing mechanism is going to be automatic, let's say if there is another crisis in coming years, if there are hundreds of thousands of people arriving on the Greek islands again, there will be an automatic trigger whereby people are shared out. And if you don't take your share, you will effectively be fined.
Simon, there are positive sort of sounds coming out of Brussels today, but this isn't a done deal. Just remind us what's due to happen next.
You cannot pick and choose when you are part of this union or not.
Well, clearly, not a free ride is the expression that Frans Timmermans said. The Turkish government have done very well. Here they've received a very public endorsement for their efforts so far. It is clear from the European perspective that they have done a lot to meet their side of the bargain, to meet the 72 benchmarks. There are 5 remaining ones that they have to comply with, and I think some of those are quite complicated, very political and sensitive issues for the Turkish government to deal with. Whether they can do that by the end of June, that's the big challenge. And let's not lose sight of the ability of things like the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers here in Brussels to potentially put a spanner in the works. This is a very strong Commission recommendation. The Commission laying down a marker saying we think the Turks should have visa liberalisation by the end of June. We think they're going to do what's necessary. But the European Parliament, within which there are some very discordant voices, one only has to think of the French National Front and other extremist right-wing anti-immigration parties within the Parliament, can raise objections to this deal. The Parliament has to vote it through by the end of June if it comes into effect, for it to come into effect. So it's a very good day for Turkey, but the deal is not done yet.
OK, Simon McGregor-Wood, good to talk to you live in Brussels.